She was born not into a cradle of comfort but into a throne of obligation. From the moment she first opened her eyes, she was a living emblem of her family's legacy, bound to a destiny written long before she drew her first breath. Her birth was celebrated not because she was a child, but because she was a piece of a grander plan, a tool for her parents, for the court, and for a kingdom that viewed her not as flesh and blood, but as a political key to survival. Her earliest memories were of cold stone walls and heavy curtains that blocked out the sun. She learned to speak not from her nursemaids, but from the stiff voices of tutors who drilled her in languages, scripture, and the rigid etiquette of the royal court. Play was forbidden. Curiosity was discouraged. Even as a child, she was constantly reminded of her duty. She was told that she must be silent when men spoke of power, that she must smile even when she was afraid, and that tears had no place in the life of one who was destined to wear a crown. And then came the day that sealed her fate. At the age of 9, when other children still dreamed of freedom and fairy tales, she was led into the council chamber. It was a room designed to intimidate. Tall, vaulted ceilings loomed overhead, portraits of stern-faced ancestors glared down from the walls, and every shadow seemed to hum with the weight of history. Her parents were there, their faces carved in stone-like determination, surrounded by advisors whose voices were low and grave. It was there she was told. She was to be married. The words struck her like cold iron. She could not comprehend them at first. Marriage was something for grown women, not for a child who still needed a stepstool to reach the high-backed chairs in the council hall. But this was not a discussion. It was a decree. Her parents explained that her wedding was not about love, not even about her. It was about survival. Their kingdom, weakened by years of unrest, could no longer stand alone. There was only one way to secure its future: an alliance with the King of Spain, a man powerful enough to crush their enemies and silence every rival. The king was no boy. He was a ruler, feared as much as he was respected, a man whose silver-streaked hair bore witness to his many years on the throne. He was old enough to be her father, and his gaze, when it fell upon her for the first time, was colder than the steel of a knight's blade. From that moment, her life was no longer her own. The preparations for the wedding began immediately. She was dressed in gowns so heavy with gold thread she could barely walk. Crowns were placed upon her head not to honor her, but to remind her of the weight she must carry. She was paraded before the court, a small and trembling girl forced to smile while courtiers whispered behind their jeweled hands. The wedding itself was a spectacle without warmth. The cathedral was draped in banners and the air thick with incense, but the ceremony felt less like a union and more like a funeral for her childhood. The king stood beside her like a mountain, unmoving and inscrutable, as priests intoned words of duty and divine will. When he placed the ring upon her finger, it was not a gesture of affection. It was the sealing of a treaty, the locking of a door behind which her freedom would vanish forever. And then the palace gates closed. Inside the royal residence, the world was even colder than she had imagined. The halls were vast and silent, lined with portraits of monarchs who had ruled with iron hands and merciless hearts. Servants moved like ghosts, speaking only in whispers. The king, her husband in name, treated her with the distant formality one might show to an object rather than a person. She was instructed in her duties as queen: how to host banquets, how to receive ambassadors, how to sit through endless councils where decisions were made in words she could barely understand. But beneath this rigid routine, something darker stirred. The palace was not only a home, it was a fortress of secrets. She noticed it first in the glances exchanged between the courtiers, in the way conversations would halt abruptly when she entered a room. The servants, though silent, sometimes spoke through their eyes, flickers of fear, pity, or warning. At night, as she lay in her massive bed, she would hear footsteps in the corridors, too many to be mere guards. And then came the whispers. They were never spoken directly to her, but she heard them nonetheless, rumors carried by half-closed doors and shadowed alcoves. They spoke of betrayal within the council, of nobles who plotted behind the king's back, of letters vanishing from the royal archives, and of a strange, unspoken truth about her own marriage. She was 9 years old. She did not understand everything she heard, but she understood enough to be afraid. The world she had been forced into was not only one of gilded luxury and royal titles. It was a cage, and within its golden bars lurked serpents. And in the silence of those endless corridors, in the vast and lonely chambers of the palace, the little queen began to change. Her fear hardened into something sharper: curiosity. She started listening more closely. She memorized every word she heard, every name whispered, every strange look exchanged. She did not yet know the truth, but she could feel it pressing in on her from every shadowed corner. And though she did not realize it yet, the first thread of a vast and terrible conspiracy was already tightening around her. The palace at night was not the same place it was by day. In daylight, it was a grand monument of stone and gold, a fortress of authority where courtiers bowed and the king's words silenced all. But after sunset, when the torches burned low and the corridors emptied, it became something else. A labyrinth of shadows and echoes, where whispers carried farther than footsteps, and silence was not always a sign of peace. The young queen often lay awake in her vast bed, listening. At first, she thought it was only her fear that kept her from sleep, but soon she realized she was not imagining the sounds that crept through the walls. Doors opened and closed when no one should have been walking. Faint voices murmured behind locked chambers. And sometimes, just before dawn, she heard what she swore were hurried footsteps passing her door, followed by the distinct sound of keys turning in locks. She was 9 years old, but she was not foolish. Her tutors had taught her history, politics, and diplomacy, but the palace itself was teaching her something different: how to watch, how to listen, and how to survive. One night, unable to bear her curiosity any longer, she slipped out of bed. Dressed in nothing but a nightgown and carrying a single candle, she followed the sound of hushed voices down the long gallery that led to the council wing. The air was cold, and every shadow seemed alive, but she pressed forward until she reached a half-closed door. Inside, she saw them, 3 men, 2 nobles and one of her husband's most trusted advisors, huddled around a table. A single lantern illuminated a stack of documents between them. "If the king continues in this way, he will bring ruin on us all," one of the nobles hissed. "Then we must act before it is too late," the advisor replied. "The girl is young. She understands nothing. When the time comes, she will not stand in our way." The girl. They were speaking of her. Her small hands trembled around the candle, but she dared not move. She could not see their faces clearly, but she recognized their voices. These were men who had bowed to her in the great hall, who had smiled at her during banquets. Now, in secret, they spoke of rebellion. That night, she returned to her chamber without a sound. Her heart was pounding, but in her fear, a new feeling was born: awareness. She realized that she was surrounded not only by servants and guards but by liars and plotters who moved like spiders in the dark. And then she began to notice even more. The king, her husband, was not blind to this unrest. He rarely spoke to her, but she saw the way his eyes followed certain men in the court. He was aware, but he did nothing. Perhaps he was waiting. Perhaps he was testing his enemies. Or perhaps he had a plan of his own. The queen began to play her part. She was small, silent, and harmless in their eyes. Just a child in an embroidered dress, someone to be ignored while the real games of power unfolded. She let them believe that. She kept her head bowed at dinners, kept her lips sealed at councils, and learned to hide her intelligence behind a mask of innocence. But all the while she was listening. One evening, during a feast, she overheard 2 ladies in waiting speaking in hurried whispers. The letters were taken again. One of them murmured, "If he finds out—" "Hush," the other warned. "Walls have ears. Letters. Stolen letters." That night, the queen made her first daring move. She dismissed her servants early and waited until the palace was silent. Then, barefoot and careful as a shadow, she crept into the library, one of the few places the king rarely visited. She had learned from observation which key the steward used to unlock its doors, and after days of watching him, she had stolen it. Inside, the library was a kingdom of secrets. The shelves were lined with scrolls and ledgers, maps marked with territories, and sealed letters bound with royal wax. She searched until she found a small, hidden compartment behind one of the bookcases. Inside it was a stack of documents, bound tightly and marked with the royal seal of Spain. But when she opened them, she froze. The letters were not addressed to the king. They were addressed to another ruler, one of Spain's enemies. And they bore the handwriting of one of the king's closest counselors. Her breath caught. It was treason. Suddenly, every strange glance, every whisper, every late-night meeting made sense. The palace was a nest of traitors, and the king either did not know, or he was letting it happen for reasons she could not yet understand. The young queen replaced the letters exactly as she had found them. She did not dare take them, not yet. She was only a child, but she was not naive enough to believe that no one would notice if they vanished. Instead, she returned to her chambers and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling. She was 9 years old, and for the first time, she understood that her marriage had not only made her a queen, it had made her a prisoner in a palace of knives. But a prisoner could still learn the shape of her cage. And if she was clever enough, she might even learn how to escape it. The palace was a prison disguised as a kingdom. By day, it gleamed with gold and ceremony. By night, it became something else. A silent labyrinth where power moved like a phantom, unseen but always present. The young queen, no older than 9, had already learned that every corridor held secrets, and every face in the court was a mask. She no longer walked like a child. Her steps were slow, careful. She had seen too much. The letters hidden in the library, the counselors whispering in the shadows, and now the realization that her husband, the King of Spain himself, was not ignorant of it all. He was watching, waiting, using her in ways she did not yet fully understand. But fear sharpened her. Each day, she sat through council meetings at her husband's side, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze lowered. To the nobles, she was still the quiet child queen, harmless and unknowing. They spoke freely in her presence, as if she were no more than a decorative figure beside the throne. But she listened. Every pause, every slip of the tongue, every glance exchanged between the counselors added to the growing puzzle in her mind. And it was in those stolen fragments that she first heard the name. The regent, one voice murmured in passing, the words spoken with the kind of caution reserved for forbidden things. Later, another counselor whispered the same name in the corner of the great hall, his eyes darting nervously as if afraid the walls might hear him. But this time there was a title attached to it, the Black Regent. The name followed her like a shadow. She asked no questions, she knew better, but it took root in her mind. Whoever this regent was, he frightened even the most arrogant traitors. And if they feared him, he was dangerous beyond measure. That night, unable to bear her growing unease, she returned to the hidden corridors of the palace. She had discovered them by accident. Narrow passageways built centuries earlier, their entrances concealed behind panels and worn tapestries. These secret paths had become her refuge, a place where she could move unseen, listening and learning. From one such passage, she found herself overlooking a room deep in the old wing of the palace, where the stones were older and colder than the rest of the castle. There she saw them again, the traitors. Not 5 this time, not 10, nearly 20 men, gathered around a single table, their faces grim and resolute. And at the head of the table was a figure cloaked in black. She could not see his face, but his presence commanded the room like a predator among lesser beasts. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried like steel across the chamber. "The king has grown complacent," the man in black declared. "He hides behind the girl, behind this illusion of unity. But soon even she will be useless. Spain will not be ruled by weakness." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. The queen's hands trembled, but she held her breath, forcing herself to remain silent. The man in black continued, "We will act on the feast of St. Michael. By dawn, the old order will fall. The girl will remain a puppet until she comes of age. And I will rule in her name." The queen's blood turned cold. She understood now. This was no rebellion against her husband alone. This was the destruction of everything, the throne, the crown, even her future. They meant to kill the king and use her as a living mask for their own rule. She fled the passage, her small feet nearly slipping on the worn stones. By the time she returned to her chamber, her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. She wanted to scream, to wake the guards, to beg the king to act. But the memory of his calculating eyes silenced her. He already knew, and yet he did nothing. The next morning he summoned her. She entered his chamber hesitantly, expecting anger or indifference, but instead, she found him alone. No guards, no advisors, only the king, standing by the window, staring out over his city. "You've been listening," he said without turning to face her. Her throat went dry. "Do not deny it," he continued. "You are your father's daughter. You see things most would miss. That is why I chose you." "Chose me?" she whispered. Finally, he turned, his expression carved from stone. "Do you think I would marry a child for sentiment? No. You are more than an alliance. You are my weapon. No one suspects you. That is why you will watch them for me." His words struck her like a blow. He had never looked at her as a husband might look at a wife. He had looked at her the way a general studies a blade. And in that moment, she understood. She was not only a prisoner. She was also a tool. From that day, she obeyed. She learned to smile at the traitors while secretly memorizing their every word. She attended their feasts, their ceremonies, their endless games of politics, and she listened, silent and unseen. Each night, she brought what she learned to the king in quiet, secret meetings. And piece by piece, the web unfolded. The Black Regent was not merely an advisor or a noble. He was a phantom of the court, a man whose influence stretched from the highest lords to the lowest servants. He moved in darkness, leaving no evidence, only fear. But the queen also noticed something else, something that made her blood run cold. The regent knew about her. One evening, as she passed through the great hall, a folded note appeared among her belongings. No servant admitted to placing it there. No one even saw it happen. But the message was clear, written in a hand she did not recognize. "Little queen, be careful where you listen. Some doors are not meant to be opened." Her hands shook as she read it. He knew. And for the first time, the child queen realized that she was no longer merely a spy in a dangerous game. She was being hunted in it. The night before the feast of St. Michael was the longest night of the young queen's life. She sat in her chamber, staring at the flickering light of a single candle. Beyond the heavy doors, the palace was silent, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of sharpened blades hidden in the dark. She had uncovered the truth. The Black Regent, the shadow who ruled in whispers, was preparing to strike. The king knew it too. Yet he waited, calm and immovable, as though he were inviting his enemies to come closer. And in that waiting, there was something terrifying. The quiet certainty of a man who had laid his trap. When dawn came, the palace bloomed with false celebration. Banners of gold and crimson hung from every wall. Torches burned brightly in the halls, and servants hurried with trembling hands to prepare the feast. Nobles arrived dressed in their finest silks, each one smiling too broadly, laughing too loudly, while their eyes darted like thieves. The queen, in her heavy ceremonial gown, watched it all from her throne. She was no longer the frightened child she had been. She was silent, observing, and behind her gaze was a mind sharpened by fear and survival. Then the doors of the great hall closed. The feast began. Wine flowed. Music rose from the gallery. The king sat beside her, his face expressionless, his hand steady on the armrest of his throne. If he felt fear, he did not show it. And the queen, watching him from the corner of her eye, realized why his enemies feared him so deeply. He was a man carved from stone, unshakable even in the face of treachery. Hours passed. The hall was filled with forced merriment, but underneath it, tension crackled like a storm. The queen saw it in the conspirators' eyes, the way they exchanged glances, the subtle movements of their hands toward hidden daggers. And then it happened. The doors of the great hall burst open with a deafening crash. A man cloaked in black strode through the entrance, followed by armed soldiers who bore no royal insignia. The music stopped. The laughter died. Even the nobles who had not joined the conspiracy shrank back in terror. The Black Regent had come. He removed his hood, but not his mask. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "The reign of the old king ends tonight," he declared. "Spain will no longer be ruled by a relic clinging to a throne that does not belong to him. Lay down your arms, and I will be merciful." A gasp swept through the hall. Guards shifted uneasily, but none dared to move. The queen's small hands clenched the edge of her throne until her knuckles ached. And then, the king laughed. It was not the laughter of amusement, but of cold triumph. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet. "Mercy?" he said, his voice echoing through the vaulted chamber. "You come to my hall with thieves and traitors at your back, and you speak to me of mercy?" The Black Regent did not answer. The king raised a single hand. "Now!" And then the trap was sprung. Hidden doors along the walls burst open, and from them poured the king's loyal guards, hundreds of them armed and ready. They had been there all along, concealed in secret passages that only the king knew. Steel clashed against steel as the hall erupted into chaos. The traitors, caught off guard, fought desperately, but they were outnumbered. The queen watched in frozen silence as the battle unfolded before her. Blades flashed in the torchlight, men screamed, and the polished floors of the great hall turned red with blood. But through it all, the Black Regent stood unmoving. Even as his followers fell, he remained calm. Slowly, he reached up and removed his mask. The queen's breath caught in her throat. It was the king's brother. The resemblance was unmistakable, though twisted by bitterness and ambition. Gasps spread through the hall, but the king only stared at him with grim certainty. "I knew it was you," the king said. "You think I would not recognize the stench of betrayal in my own blood?" The Black Regent smiled, a cruel, thin smile that never reached his eyes. "You are too old to rule," he said. "Spain needs strength, not a dying monarch hiding behind a child bride. When you are gone, I will guide her. She will be my puppet, and through her, I will command the crown." The king's jaw tightened, but he did not falter. "You will guide no one." At his signal, the loyal guards closed in. The regent fought like a man possessed, but even his skill could not save him. Within moments, he was disarmed, forced to his knees before the throne. The king stepped forward, his voice low but deadly. "I should have you executed where you kneel, but death is too kind for you." He gestured to his men. "Lock him away. Let him rot in the dark with nothing but his hunger for a crown he will never wear." As the traitors were dragged away in chains, the hall grew quiet once more. The nobles who had remained loyal bowed their heads, trembling, while those who had secretly conspired with the regent avoided the queen's gaze. They knew their fates would be decided by the king's mercy or his wrath. And then, at last, the king turned to her. "You see now," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "This is the world you were born into. A crown is not a gift. It is a burden, a blade that cuts deeper than any sword. One day you will bear it alone. And when that day comes, remember this night." The queen looked up at him. For the first time, she understood. Her marriage had stolen her childhood, but it had given her something far more dangerous. She had learned how to watch, how to listen, how to see the truth behind the smiles of liars. She was only 9, but she was no longer a child. That night, as the palace returned to its cold, silent order, she stood in her chamber and gazed out over the city below. The Black Regent was gone, but his shadow remained. And she knew that one day, the same venom that had poisoned her husband's court would come for her. But she would be ready, because queens are not born. They are made in blood and betrayal, and she was already becoming one.